I'm Lauren Bennett, 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like a background extra in someone else's play. The night my mother showed up at my office unannounced, dressed in pearls and confidence, she said she'd come to celebrate my success. But in her purse was a folded piece of paper that made my blood run cold. I thought she wanted reconciliation, maybe forgiveness. Instead, she handed me an invoice for motherhood, complete with a total that read $1 million. I had built a company that was changing lives, yet in that moment I realized my own family still saw me as something to be billed and owned. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth when the people closest to you couldn't see it. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked perfectly ordinary from the street. White shutters trimmed hedges of flagpole by the porch. People waved from their driveways and said, "The Bennetts have such a lovely family." Inside, though, everything revolved around my younger sister, Allison. My mother called her our miracle girl, the light of her life, the one who made every family photo look complete. At dinner, my father discussed his clients while my mother gushed about Allison's new recital costume or her latest dance trophy. My part was to clear the dishes and nod at the right times. When I brought home straight A's, my father didn't look up from his newspaper. My mother would only say, "We don't brag in this house, Lauren," but somehow bragging about Allison never counted. By the time I was 12, I'd learned to take pride quietly. I volunteered at the library, entered science fairs, and found peace in the logic of equations. The smell of lemon cleaner and the sound of the dishwasher running became the soundtrack of invisibility. I told myself that being overlooked meant being independent, that I could build a life without applause. But independence born from neglect doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like standing outside your own window watching everyone else eat dinner. At 16, the pattern became impossible to ignore. On Allison's birthday, a shiny silver car sat in the driveway wrapped with a red ribbon wide enough to catch the sunlight. The same night, my mother handed me Allison's old bus pass and told me to be grateful. I smiled because that was easier than arguing. Every celebration shimmered in that same shade of red bows, balloons, flowers like the color itself belonged to Allison. I pretended it didn't bother me, but some colors stay burned in memory. When I earned a scholarship to the state university, I rehearsed my request for help with housing a dozen times. I waited until after dinner when Dad's plate was empty and Mom was folding laundry. "I'll need a little help with room and board," I said carefully. Without looking up, he muttered, "You've got scholarships, don't you? You'll manage." My mother nodded, already distracted by the dryer buzzer. That was the night I realized the word family could close a door just as easily as it could open one. I filled out the student loan forms under a single desk lamp, the pen shaking in my hand, and told myself I would manage because no one else ever would. College was a blur of late labs, microwave noodles, and side jobs that paid barely enough for rent. I sent short messages home at first updates that never got replies. The family group chat kept glowing with photos of Allison's new dresses, her beach trips, her engagement ring. I muted the notifications the day I saw a picture of her holding condo keys beside a lake, a red ribbon tied to the door handle. "Happy 21st baby girl," the caption read. 2 bedrooms, granite counters, water view. No one had ever asked if I had money for rent. Something inside me went very still. I didn't cry, didn't throw my phone. I just stared at that screen until it dimmed the image of that ribbon searing into my mind like a warning. Some gifts don't stop hurting. They only change shape. From that night on, I stopped thinking of home as a place I could return to. It became a concept I'd already outgrown. Dr. Elaine Cruz entered my life during my junior year. She was the head of a small biomedical research lab, brilliant but unassuming, the kind of person who carried calm with her. She hired me as an assistant, and for the first time someone looked at my work and saw potential instead of obligation. "You think for yourself, Lauren," she told me once. "That's rare." The quiet hum of centrifuges and the smell of ethanol became my refuge. In that lab, silence didn't mean neglect, it meant focus. Each successful experiment felt like proof that I existed beyond my family's blind spot. By graduation, I had built a wall of calm around me, the kind that looks like strength, but is really just self-protection. Dr. Cruz noticed anyway. "Whatever you're chasing," she said one afternoon, "I hope it's for you, not against someone else." I wanted to tell her it was both, but I just nodded. When Stanford offered me a fully funded PhD position, I packed my dented Honda and drove west without saying goodbye. Somewhere between the interstate exits, I stopped feeling like a daughter and started feeling like someone new. Stanford was another world-warm light ocean air, and people who measured worth in discovery, not attention. For the first time, silence didn't hurt. It cleared space for thought. I built a life made of numbers and early mornings, and I learned that peace could sound like fluorescent lights humming over empty halls. But peace built on distance is fragile. One photograph, one red ribbon can still break the spell. And years later, when my name would finally appear in Forbes, and my research would reach the world, that same shade of red would find me again this time, carried by the woman who had given me life and nearly taken my spirit with it. The summer after I left home for college, the house I'd grown up in already felt like someone else's memory. My old room became a storage space for Allison's dance costumes, and no one asked where I planned to live once classes started. When the semester began, I rented a small basement apartment, off-campus thin carpet, creaking pipes, and a single window that faced the back of a brick wall. The smell of instant noodles hung in the air, and the heater made a soft clicking sound all night long. I told myself it was temporary, that independence had to start somewhere. My scholarship covered tuition but not much else, so I worked weekends at a grocery store and took lab shifts that ran until midnight. Every dollar went to rent and textbooks. There were nights when the only light in the room came from my desk lamp shining over half-finished notes and stacks of loan statements. I kept my phone face down most of the time. The family group chat never went silent. Vacation photos. Allison's new dresses captions from my mother that read, "So proud of our girl." No one noticed that I never replied. Dr. Cruz's lab was the only place that felt steady. The hum of the centrifuges, the soft rhythm of pipettes clicking, the clean scent of ethanol. It was the sound of order in a life that had been anything but. She treated me like a colleague, not a shadow. "You don't just follow directions, Lauren," she said once, glancing over my notebook. "You actually think through the problem." No one in my family had ever said anything like that to me. For the first time, I felt seen in a way that didn't require me to fight for attention. When winter break came, I stayed on campus. The dorms were quiet, snow piling against the windows, the rest of the students gone home to families that wanted them back. My mother sent one text on Christmas morning, a picture of Allison by the tree, holding a wrapped box with a red ribbon tied in a perfect bow. The caption read, "Our miracle girl, opening her surprise." I didn't open the photo again. Instead, I walked to the campus cafe and spent the day grading data sheets for Dr. Cruz. It was easier to count numbers than absences. By the time spring arrived, exhaustion had become routine. I lived on coffee, took notes until sunrise, and learned how to stretch groceries for a week. When my classmates went out, I stayed behind. I wasn't lonely. I was focused. At least that's what I told myself. Then one afternoon, while scrolling through my phone during a short break, I saw a post that froze me in place. It was from my mother standing beside Allison on a balcony overlooking a lake. In her hand, Allison held a shiny new key with a red ribbon looped through it. "Happy 21st to our baby girl, your first condo," the caption read. Granite countertops, lake view, and a smile that could have been pulled straight from one of my mother's holiday cards. I stared at the photo until the screen dimmed. No one had ever offered me help with rent, not even when I was sleeping on a mattress that touched the cold cement floor. I didn't throw my phone. I just set it face down, picked up my pen, and went back to recording data. That night, I stopped checking the family chat for good. Some wounds don't break the skin, they just keep bleeding quietly. When the semester ended, Dr. Cruz asked if I planned to visit home for the summer. I told her no, that I'd stay and help with research. She nodded, but gave me that look, the kind that said she understood more than I'd said aloud. "Just make sure you rest sometimes," she said. "Even machines need downtime." I smiled because it was easier than explaining that breaks were expensive. A few months later, she called me into her office. The space was always a little messy. Stacks of journals, empty coffee cups, sunlight through half-closed blinds. She motioned for me to sit. "You've been different lately," she said. "Not in a bad way, just focused. Whatever you're chasing, make sure it's for you, not against someone else." Her words hung in the air longer than I expected. I wanted to tell her she was right, that I was chasing something for myself, but part of me knew the truth was more complicated. When Stanford offered me a fully funded doctoral position that fall, I accepted within the hour. I didn't tell my parents. There was nothing left to tell. I packed my car, loaded it with notebooks, plants that had seen too many late nights, and a coffee maker that never quit, then started driving west. The highway stretched for miles, a ribbon of asphalt lined with cornfields that slowly turned to desert, then mountains. Somewhere along that drive, I realized I hadn't felt homesick once. The word home had lost its shape. California felt like another planet. The air smelled of eucalyptus and salt, and the campus lights stayed on long after midnight. The labs were bigger, brighter, and busier, but the rhythm was the same. The quiet hum of machines, the soft shuffle of papers, the click of data filling spreadsheets. I found peace in the predictability. No one here cared about family status or red ribbons. They cared about results, about ideas. I belonged in that world of focus and fluorescence. During my third year, I built a research project that turned heads a polymer designed to deliver targeted cancer treatments. It started as a small experiment but grew into something more. The department gave me my own bench space, and Dr. Cruz, who had since moved west herself, stopped by occasionally to check on me. Still chasing, she asked once, a half-smile on her face. I only said, "Still building." After graduation, the project became a startup. A few of us stayed on: engineers, scientists, people who had learned to live on caffeine and persistence. Mark Evans joined the team soon after, a quiet engineer with the kind of steady calm that balanced the chaos of research deadlines. We worked side by side until the late hours building something real, something we believed could help people. Success came slowly at first. Then all at once, investors' media coverage, our first patent. The company grew and my name started appearing in places I never expected. When Forbes called for an interview, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. A week later, my picture was in the magazine under the headline, "Women Changing Biotech." I didn't send it home. I figured if my parents ever saw it, it would be by accident. They did. A friend texted me late one night, "Your mom just posted about you." I opened Facebook for the first time in years. There was my mother smiling proudly beside Allison. The caption read, "So proud of my daughters, one running a business, the other changing the world. A mother's sacrifices are finally worth it." I read the words twice. Sacrifices. The word felt heavy in my chest. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly a decade, and now she was rewriting history for an audience that didn't know better. For a moment I considered replying, maybe correcting her, but I didn't. I realized she hadn't written that post for me. She'd written it for herself. So I let it sit there unchallenged. Silence, I had learned, can be louder than confrontation. I turned off my phone and went back to work. A few weeks later, my assistant buzzed through the intercom. "Lauren, there's someone here asking for you. She says she's family." My hand froze halfway to the keyboard. Family. It had been years since that word felt real. I told her to send the visitor in. When the door opened, I smelled her perfume before I saw her vanilla and something sharper underneath. My mother walked in like she owned the air in the room, pearls at her neck, a practiced smile on her face. "Lauren," she said, arms wide, "look at you." That was the first time I'd seen her since I'd left Ohio, and I knew before she even spoke why she was really there. When my mother walked into my office that afternoon, she looked around as if she were inspecting a museum exhibit she didn't believe was real. The glass walls framed patents and soft hum of machines seemed to make her uneasy. She touched the back of one of the chairs and smiled the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "So this is where all the genius happens," she said. "You didn't even tell us. Imagine my surprise seeing your face in Forbes." I stood behind my desk, unsure whether to sit or walk out. "You could have called," I told her. "Oh, I did," she replied almost cheerfully. "You changed your number. I figured you were just busy." She placed her purse neatly on the desk, opened it, and began to pull something out with deliberate care. "Family should celebrate together." "Right," she said. The paper she unfolded looked ordinary until I saw the neat columns and the printed total at the bottom. "What is this?" I asked. It's an itemized record of everything I've done for you, she said, as if it were the most reasonable sentence in the world. Private school tuition meals, emotional labor. Her voice sharpened on that last phrase. The total comes to $1 million. I stared at her. You're asking me to pay you $1 million for being my mother? Her smile didn't move, but something in her eyes hardened. For all the sacrifices I made, for everything I gave up so you could become this. She gestured toward the window where the city stretched in the distance. Family doesn't work like that, I said quietly. Family doesn't send invoices. Her tone shifted brittle and sharp. Family doesn't abandon the woman who gave them everything she snapped. The word abandon landed like glass shattering between us. You chose to have me, I said softly. Children don't owe their parents for being born. For the first time, her expression flickered, but it lasted only a second. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice. Can't or won't? I didn't answer. My hands were steady on the desk, even though my heart wasn't. She sighed and straightened her jacket. I could have had a life, a career, a husband who stayed. But I gave it all to you, she said, and now you can't even show gratitude. The room felt smaller, then filled with a silence I couldn't break. I wanted to tell her I'd spent years trying to earn her approval, that I'd built everything she saw without her help. But I also knew nothing I said would reach her. Instead, I spoke slowly. I'll make sure you have what you need, but I'm not giving you this. She froze. Then you're no longer my daughter. The words were flat, rehearsed. She picked up her purse, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become. When the door closed, the quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was dense, almost alive. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the edge of the desk. Outside the glass, my team kept working, unaware that something irreversible had just ended. The paper lay in front of me, the printed total staring back like a verdict. I sat down and read each line, my eyes catching on the smallest things. Grocery bills, time spent raising you, emotional distress. By the time I reached the bottom, my vision blurred. The number no longer mattered. It was what it represented that hollowed me out. When the tears finally came, they didn't crash. They slipped through quietly, the way a long drought ends slow, steady, unremarkable to anyone but the one who's been waiting for rain. By morning, I wasn't crying anymore. I walked into the lab before sunrise, before anyone could see my face. The machines hummed their steady rhythm, and the soft blue light of the monitors filled the room. I began a new synthesis, moving through each step with precision. Measuring, recording, repeating. The control of the process steadied me. Dr. Cruz arrived an hour later. She stopped at the doorway holding a cup of coffee, studying me the way she always did, patiently, as if she were waiting for me to decide whether to speak. She came, didn't she? She asked quietly. I didn't ask how she knew. She always knew. She wants money, I said. $1 million. Dr. Cruz didn't flinch. She set the coffee beside me and leaned against the counter. And what do you want? It was a question I hadn't considered. I stared at the condensation on the glass beaker before answering. Peace, I said, finally. But I don't think it's refundable. That night, after the office emptied, I changed into the champagne-colored dress I'd worn for the company event earlier in the week and sat on the floor of my office bathroom. My reflection in the mirror across from me looked composed, distant, almost unfamiliar. The woman who had built a company that changed lives was sitting barefoot on tile, holding her own trembling hands. I remembered every Sunday dinner when my mother said, "We do everything for you girls," and every silent car ride home when I tried to believe it. Every time I mistook her control for love, her manipulation for sacrifice. 2 days later, I met with my attorney, Michael Landon, a calm, gray-haired man who had handled the company's contracts since the beginning. I told him to establish a trust for my mother enough to cover her basic expenses, but with strict limits. She can't withdraw more than the monthly allowance, I said, and she can't touch the principal. He looked up over his glasses. You're protecting her from herself. I shook my head. I'm protecting me from her. The paperwork took a week. By the time it was finalized, the calls had already begun. At first, they came every few hours. You'll regret this, Lauren. You can't erase me. Then the tone changed. "I forgive you, sweetheart. Let's just move past this." Later came the threats. "Maybe people should know how ungrateful you are." I stopped answering. Mark noticed the strain before I said anything. One evening while we were sitting on the couch, my phone lit up over and over on the coffee table. He reached for it, but I stopped him. "You don't have to read them," he said softly. "I'm not," I told him. "I just need to see how far she'll go." Eventually, the messages slowed. The silence that followed wasn't peace exactly. It was space finally cleared. I learned that sometimes quiet is its own boundary. Weeks later, Dr. Cruz called me into her office again. The room was warm with afternoon light. "You've been working like someone's chasing you," she said. I smiled faintly. "Is it over?" she asked. I hesitated before nodding. "Almost." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed ticket to a coastal retreat, a quiet weekend by the water. "Go somewhere that isn't built from adrenaline," she said. "Even the strongest need stillness." That evening, I stood by the window of my office, watching the city lights shimmer against the glass. For the first time, I let myself breathe without waiting for something else to collapse. My mother had wanted control. What she got was distance. I didn't owe her an apology, and she couldn't send another invoice for that. When the sun dipped behind the skyline, the reflection of the city faded into the dark, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child, quiet, steady, earned. The months that followed my mother's visit passed like a long exhale I didn't know I'd been holding. The calls stopped, the noise fell away, and the space she left behind began to fill with quiet. In that quiet, I started to rebuild not as a daughter trying to prove her worth, but as a woman who finally understood the weight of peace. The trust Michael had established worked exactly as it was meant to. A steady monthly allowance reached her account, but she couldn't touch anything else. For once, control was out of her hands. Work became the constant that held me together. The lab lights, the steady hum of machines, the calm focus of data sheets each day began and ended with the same rhythm. Dr. Cruz checked in every few days, her presence never intrusive, but always grounding. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said once. "When silence feels heavier than noise." I knew what she meant. It wasn't just the absence of my mother's voice. It was the absence of needing her approval. That silence carried its own kind of weight. Mark and I worked side by side most nights, finishing reports or adjusting prototypes. He never asked questions about my family, though he must have sensed there was more to the story. His patience was a kind of understanding I hadn't known before, steady, wordless, without expectation. One evening he handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You know, most people would have just written her a check." I smiled faintly. "That's the difference," I said. Most people didn't grow up being told they owed their existence. By early spring, our company was growing faster than we'd planned. We signed new investors, expanded our clinical trials, and began talks for a potential acquisition. The days blurred together presentations, lab results, late-night calls. Somewhere in the middle of all that movement, the ache inside me began to ease. I stopped checking the family chat. I stopped expecting apologies. Some wounds don't close because someone says sorry. They close because you finally stop reopening them. 3 months later, we hosted a private dinner for our lead investors. The restaurant overlooked the bay, soft jazz playing under the low light. I wore a simple black dress and felt for the first time like I belonged in my own life. Mark gave the opening speech steady and thoughtful, and when he mentioned my name, the room applauded. I caught my reflection in the window, calm, unshaken, and realized how far I'd come from the girl who used to study in a basement apartment. After the dinner, Dr. Cruz pulled me aside. "You're doing well," she said, "but make sure you know what you're building toward, not just what you're building from." I nodded, understanding more than I could say. For years, my ambition had been fueled by pain. It was time to let it be guided by purpose. The acquisition talks grew serious by early fall. Representatives from a major biotech firm flew in from San Francisco, filling our conference room with the energy of opportunity. Papers lined the table's screens, displayed numbers, and every conversation revolved around valuation and vision. I sat through each meeting with quiet focus, aware that this was the moment we had worked toward for years. During one of those meetings, a message appeared on my phone. The name on the screen made my breath catch my mother's. I hadn't seen it in months. The text was short, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long moment before locking the screen and sliding the phone face down. Some doors once closed shouldn't reopen. That night, I returned to my apartment and found an envelope under my door. No return address, just my name written in neat looping letters I knew too well. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I'm sorry it began. I shouldn't have said what I did. But the next line changed everything. We could fix this together. You have the resources, and I have the name. We could make it right for our family." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. It wasn't an apology, it was another transaction, another attempt to turn love into a contract. I left it on the counter and didn't reply. 2 weeks later, the acquisition was finalized. The deal valued our company at $80 million. Investors toasted with champagne cameras flashed, and my name appeared again in headlines I still didn't read. When the applause faded, I stepped outside for air. The wind off the Pacific was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. Mark joined me on the balcony, holding 2 glasses of water. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. For the first time in a long while, I said. From that point on, life moved forward. Mark and I grew close, our partnership deepening into something steady and genuine. We traveled for conferences, launched new projects, and built a company culture that valued balance as much as brilliance. Dr. Cruz stayed involved as an advisor, her wisdom shaping every major decision. Slowly, the world I had built began to feel like home, not the one I'd been born into, but the one I chose. 8 years passed in what felt like seasons of calm. Our company expanded across 3 states, and we began a scholarship program for girls in science named in honor of Dr. Cruz. My mother and I never spoke again. The trust continued to function quietly. Payments sent like clockwork, each one a reminder that boundaries can coexist with compassion. Then one autumn morning while driving through Seattle on my way to a conference, I saw her. She was sitting on the curb outside a small coffee shop, a paper cup in her hand. Gray hair, tangled eyes, dim but unmistakable. I pulled over before I had time to think. The world around me slowed as I walked toward her. For a moment she didn't recognize me. Then her eyes lifted and she whispered Lauren, her voice uncertain, as if she were afraid to finish the word. We sat there for an hour, 2 cups of coffee cooling between us. She told me she was sick. Pride had taken what the world hadn't. When we stood to leave, she looked down at her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You look happy," she said quietly. "I'm glad." I arranged help through the trust that same afternoon, not as repayment, but as decency. She accepted the assistance but refused to list me as her emergency contact. I didn't argue. Even at the end, she wanted the last word. That evening, I stood on my balcony, the city lights stretching out like constellations. The air was cool, the kind that carries both memory and relief. I realized peace wasn't a grand moment or a headline. It was this standing in the quiet, knowing I had survived without bitterness. What came next wasn't victory, it was calm. And for someone like me, calm had always been the rarest thing of all. It had been months since that brief meeting outside the coffee shop, yet her voice still echoed. Sometimes the fragile way she said my name, the weight behind it. She hadn't recognized me right away, and maybe that was fitting. The woman I had become bore little resemblance to the daughter she once controlled. After that morning, the trust quietly resumed its rhythm payments on schedule boundaries intact. For a while, it almost felt like peace could last. But peace, I've learned, doesn't stay still. It started with a letter that arrived on a gray Tuesday. The handwriting was hers, tight, slanted, familiar. Inside, she thanked me for the coffee and added a note that made my chest tighten. "You've done well. It's time to help your family again." That was all it said. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had come before. I placed it on my desk beside the framed photo of our team at the company's first product launch and left it there untouched for days. By the end of that week, the calls started again. They came through the company line, this time filtered by assistants who didn't know what to make of the woman demanding to speak to me. "Tell her it's important," she said once, her voice clipped businesslike. I never returned the calls. Each message felt like the ghost of a life I'd buried trying to claw its way back. Mark noticed the tension before I said anything. One night after a late meeting, he found me still in my office, the city lights glowing across the glass. "She's calling again, isn't she?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't press. He just said, "Then we protect what you've built." And somehow that sentence carried more comfort than any promise of understanding could. A week later, a courier arrived at our office with a sealed envelope. No return address, just my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was a formal letter drafted by her new attorney. It claimed she had been emotionally distressed by estrangement, and that her contributions to my early education and upbringing constituted a recoverable debt. At the bottom was a line that made my stomach twist. She was requesting a settlement of $1 million. I sat there in silence, the air in the office humming with the faint buzz of machines. When I finally looked up, Mark was standing in the doorway. He didn't need to ask. I handed him the letter. He read it, his jaw tightening, then folded it once and placed it back on my desk. "She's testing how far you'll bend," he said. I exhaled slowly. Not this time. That night I called Michael Landon. He was calm, deliberate as always. "I can handle this quietly," he said. "If she pursues it formally, it won't hold up, but I'll file the necessary protections." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in the dark for a long time. It wasn't just the demand that stung, it was the familiarity of it, the way she always turned love into a ledger. Days passed, and the silence between us stretched again. Then came a new kind of noise, the media. Someone had tipped a local paper about the family conflict involving a prominent biotech founder. They didn't use names, but the details were close enough to make it obvious. A reporter left a voicemail asking for comment. I deleted it before it finished playing. Dr. Cruz called that evening. "You've been quiet lately," she said. Her voice had that calm steadiness that could make even bad news sound survivable. I told her what had happened, how the past refused to stay buried. There was a long pause. "You've spent years proving who you are," she said softly. "Don't let her make you prove it again." I took her words with me into every decision after that. When the media attention faded, I focused on work. Our company's merger had created new opportunities, partnerships, grants, expansion projects. The future we'd worked for was finally unfolding. But even in the middle of progress, the letter stayed on my desk. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, though I didn't know why. By early winter, I received an unexpected call from the director of a regional science foundation. "We'd like to feature your story," he said. "Not just your company, but your personal journey, the resilience behind the innovation." I hesitated. The idea of telling my story publicly made me uneasy, but something about the timing felt right. For once, I wanted to speak in my own words, not through rumor or headlines. The interview took place in a quiet studio overlooking the harbor. The lights were soft, the air cool. The host asked about the company, my team, and eventually my upbringing. I answered carefully, honestly, without bitterness. "Some people build from encouragement," I said. "Others build from what they never received." The segment aired 2 weeks later, and within days it reached more viewers than I expected. Then for the first time in years, the phone rang, not from reporters, but from people I'd never met. Letters arrived from young women studying science, from single mothers, putting themselves through night school, from people who saw their own reflection in the silence I had survived. The response was overwhelming, humbling, and deeply human. And then one morning, a new letter arrived. The handwriting was weaker this time. Inside was one short line, "Thank you for the coffee." That was all. No signature, no request, just that single memory acknowledged. I read it twice before folding it gently and placing it in the same drawer as the first. Weeks later, a social worker from the trust office called. "Your mother accepted the help," she said. "She's staying at a residential care home near the lake. Her condition is stable, but she didn't list you as an emergency contact." I thanked her and hung up. For a moment I stood by the window watching the late afternoon light spill over the water. Even now she wanted the last word, and somehow that felt all right. The following weekend I drove to that same lake. The air was cool, the surface of the water still enough to reflect the sky. I sat on a bench for a long time, thinking about how distance can become a kind of mercy. I didn't go inside the care home, and I didn't call ahead. I simply left a small bouquet of white lilies at the entrance, a quiet gesture, nothing more. As I walked back to the car, I felt something loosen, something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. It wasn't forgiveness exactly or closure. It was release. That night, I stood on my balcony again, the city alive below me. The hum of life in every direction. Peace, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or recognition. It moves softly like the sound of water against the shore, steady and calm. In the months that followed, I focused on expanding our scholarship fund for girls entering STEM programs. We named it the Elaine Cruz Foundation, honoring the woman who had taught me that strength doesn't have to be loud to be real. Watching the first group of students receive their awards brought a quiet pride I hadn't known before. Some nights when the world grew still, I thought about the red ribbons that once defined my family's love, how they used to tie everything beautiful to something that hurt. But now, in the quiet rhythm of my work and the laughter of my team, I'd learned that peace could exist without performance. What came next wasn't revenge or victory. It was something smaller, softer, more permanent. It was the life I had built after the noise faded. The months after my mother's letter felt like the first stretch of stillness I'd had in years. Work kept me anchored, new partnerships, steady growth, and the launch of our scholarship foundation. The world moved forward, and for once I wasn't chasing or running from anything. I was simply living. But stillness doesn't last forever. One morning while reviewing lab results, my assistant buzzed through. "There's a woman on the line," she said. "She says she's from the trust office." I picked up half expecting paperwork. Instead, the voice that greeted me was careful and calm. "Ms. Bennett, this is Jenna Patel. I oversee your mother's account. I'm calling because there's been a development you should be aware of." The pause that followed said more than her tone. I set down my pen. "Go ahead." "She's been hospitalized," Jenna said softly. "It isn't critical, but her condition has declined. The facility's recommending longer-term care. They'll manage everything through the trust, of course, but we wanted you informed." I thanked her, took down the details, and ended the call. For a long while, I sat at my desk, staring at the city through the glass. There was no surge of emotion, no anger, no relief. Just a quiet ache that felt as old as memory itself. That evening, Mark found me still at the office. "Something happened," he said, watching me closely. I nodded. "She's sick. They think she needs full-time care." He waited for me to say more, but there wasn't much to add. "Are you going to see her?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, and that was the truth. A few days later, I drove to the facility on the outskirts of the city. The building was simple white walls, trimmed hedges, the kind of calm that feels borrowed. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender. When I reached the front desk, the nurse smiled politely. "Room 214, she said, and pointed down the hall. She didn't see me when I stepped in. The sunlight from the window touched her hair, now gray and thin. A blanket covered her knees, and a cup of tea sat cooling beside her. For a moment I just watched her breathe. The woman who had once filled rooms with sharp words now looked small, almost weightless. When she finally looked up, confusion flickered, then recognition. "Lauren," she whispered. It wasn't the voice I remembered. I sat beside her, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. The hum of a nearby television filled the quiet. "You came," she said finally. "I didn't think you would." "I heard you weren't well," I replied. She smiled faintly. "I've had better days." Her hands trembled as she reached for the tea. I steadied the cup for her without thinking. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, the food, the view from her window. Not the past, not the years between us. When the nurse came to check on her, she introduced me as my daughter, like it was a name she'd just remembered. I stayed another half hour before standing to leave. As I turned toward the door, she said quietly, "You always did manage on your own." I didn't know if it was meant as praise or blame. Either way, it landed somewhere deep in that place where old wounds and acceptance blur together. On the drive home, the city lights came into view one by one, reflecting against the windshield. I realized there was nothing left to prove, not to her, not to anyone. What remained was choice, how to live now that the story between us had reached its final chapter. A few weeks later, she was moved to a smaller care home near the lake, one that offered hospice services. Jenna called regularly with updates, each one shorter than the last. "She's stable," she'd say. "Comfortable." I listened, thanked her, and went back to my work. But some nights I found myself standing by the window wondering if comfort meant peace or just waiting. When the call finally came, it was just after sunrise. Jenna's voice was soft. "She passed early this morning," she said. It was peaceful. The staff said she was resting. I sat in silence, one hand on the windowsill. Outside, the sky was streaked with pale orange, the city still half asleep. Jenna continued. "She left instructions. She didn't want a service, just a private burial. The trust will cover arrangements unless you'd like to be involved." I thanked her and told her to proceed as written. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, watching the light shift across the glass. There were no tears, just a quiet finality that felt heavier than grief. A week later, I received a small box from the trust office. Inside was a folded note written in a shaky hand. "You did well. I hope you find peace." Beneath it was the same bracelet I'd made for her in grade school. A crooked chain of beads, long faded, the clasp nearly broken. I turned it over in my hand, remembering the child who'd waited by the window for her mother's smile and never quite got it. I placed the bracelet in my desk drawer, next to the letters she'd sent over the years, and closed it quietly. Life resumed as it always does. Work filled the days, and the Scholarship Foundation grew faster than we'd expected. We funded research grants, hosted mentorship programs, and watched new faces step into the world with the kind of confidence I once had to invent. At the dedication ceremony for the Foundation's new campus wing, Dr. Cruz stood beside me. Her hair had more gray now, but her eyes held the same calm certainty they always had. "You've built something lasting," she said. "Something good." I smiled. "You taught me how." Later that night, I walked through the empty halls alone. The glass walls reflected the lights from the city below, soft and distant. I thought about how every version of me, child, student, founder, had carried pieces of the past until all that was left was balance. Not perfection, just peace that didn't demand forgetting. Mark found me in the hallway. "You ready to go home?" he asked. I nodded, taking one last look at the plaque on the wall, Elaine Cruz Foundation for Women in Science. Below it, smaller letters read, "Dedicated to those who built their own way forward." On the drive home, the night air was cool, and the city stretched quiet ahead of us. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving something unfinished behind. By the time we reached our street, I glanced at Mark and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How peace can be so quiet." He smiled, one hand resting over mine. "That's how you know it's real," he said. And in that moment, with the lights of the city fading behind us, I realized he was right. The morning of the acquisition ceremony arrived crisp and bright sunlight spilling across the Pacific like a quiet promise. Months of negotiations, years of long nights in the lab, all of it had led to this moment. Our company, the one I'd started from a single rented workspace, was now valued at $80 million. Cameras lined the lobby. Guests filled the hall. Every handshake felt like the closing of a chapter I'd written with equal parts exhaustion and faith. The speeches passed in a blur. Mark stood beside me, steady as always, fielding questions from investors and smiling for photographs. When my turn came to speak, I kept it short. I talked about innovation, collaboration, and the importance of purpose. My voice didn't shake, though my hands felt faintly cold. I looked across the audience and realized that for the first time, no one there was waiting for me to fail. Afterward, reporters circled microphones, angled lights bright enough to sting my eyes. I gave measured answers, polite, firm, deliberate. The noise was almost comforting. It meant everything we had built was real. Still, when the last camera flash faded, I felt the familiar need for air. I slipped outside onto the terrace, the sound of the ocean just beneath the hum of traffic. The sky had turned a deep, late afternoon blue. Mark joined me after a few minutes, a glass of sparkling water in his hand instead of champagne. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I am." He leaned against the railing, looking out toward the horizon. "It's strange," he said. "All this noise, and somehow it feels quiet out here." He was right. Beneath the applause and headlines there was stillness, the kind that comes only when something long and heavy finally lands. "Peace doesn't roar," I said softly. "It just hums." 8 years passed in the same steady rhythm. The company grew beyond anything I could have imagined. We expanded to new cities, launched new research programs, and built a reputation for the kind of work that didn't just profit, it mattered. The foundation continued to thrive too, offering scholarships to girls who reminded me of who I used to be, determined, invisible, but quietly capable. In time, life found a balance. Dr. Cruz retired from active research, her farewell dinner filled with laughter and quiet pride. Mark and I moved into a small home near the lake, close enough that I could walk to work, but far enough that the noise of the city faded at night. My days were full meetings, travel mentoring young women in science, but they were no longer driven by pain. They were guided by peace, measured by purpose. Then one autumn morning, as I drove through downtown Seattle for a conference, a familiar figure caught my eye near a coffee shop window. Gray hair, fragile shoulders, a paper cup in her hand. I pulled over before I even thought about it. She was sitting alone on the curb coat, worn thin eyes downcast. For a moment I just stood there on the sidewalk watching the rise and fall of her breath. When I finally spoke, her head lifted slowly, uncertain. "Lauren," she whispered the word, trembling. "It's me," I said quietly. "Can I sit?" She nodded, and I sat beside her. The city moved around us, cars and voices blending into a blur that felt far away. She told me she'd left the care home months earlier. Pride, she said, had taken her where illness hadn't. Her words were fragments half-formed, drifting between memory and apology. I listened, not because I needed to, but because silence would have felt cruel. When she began to cough, I offered to take her somewhere warm, but she shook her head. "I've made my choices," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," I said, "but you don't deserve to be alone." We sat there for nearly an hour. She drank her coffee in small sips, her hands shaking. Before leaving, I told her I'd make sure she had help, real help this time, not conditional or cold. She nodded faintly, eyes glistening. "You look happy," she said, and for once it didn't sound like resentment. Later that day, I called Jenna. "There's been a change," I told her. "She's on the street. Use the trust whatever it takes. Just make sure she's safe." Jenna handled everything quietly, efficiently, as she always did. Within a week, my mother was in a new facility, one that offered comfort and dignity. I didn't visit. Not because I couldn't, but because some goodbyes are meant to be gentle from a distance. Months later, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope was thin, unmarked, the handwriting unsteady. Inside was one line, "Thank you for the coffee." No signature, no explanation, just that. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the bracelet she'd returned years earlier. It was the closest she'd ever come to saying she was sorry. And it was enough. That winter, the air around the lake carried a stillness I hadn't noticed before. On quiet evenings, Mark and I would walk the path that circled the water, the reflection of streetlights dancing on the surface. Sometimes I'd glance across the shoreline and think of her, the mother who had measured love and obligation, who had spent her life keeping score. In the end, all her numbers had added up to nothing. But for the first time, I didn't feel bitterness in that thought, only peace. The next spring, our foundation awarded its largest round of scholarships yet. I stood on the stage beside Dr. Cruz, now gray-haired and radiant, as we watched a group of young women accept their awards. Their excitement filled the room with the kind of energy that makes the future feel alive. When the applause quieted, Dr. Cruz took my hand. "You've built everything you once wished someone would build for you," she said. "Don't forget to rest inside it." That night, as the event hall emptied, I lingered by the window overlooking the city. The lights stretched across the skyline like a constellation of second chances. Somewhere out there, my mother's story had reached its end, but mine was still unfolding quietly, deliberately, in its own time. Justice hadn't come with vengeance or spectacle. It had come with peace, the kind that doesn't demand forgiveness, only freedom. In the months that followed the scholarship ceremony, life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. The noise of success had softened into something steadier, a quiet hum that no longer demanded my constant attention. The company ran smoothly under Mark's steady leadership, and the foundation continued to grow beyond anything I'd dreamed of in those early years. Each season seemed to carry a small reminder that peace wasn't a destination. It was a way of moving through the world without fear. Dr. Cruz retired fully that winter, trading her lab coat for long walks by the sea. On her last day, she gave me a small card handwritten in her looping script. "You have become the person you needed when you were younger," it said. I kept it on my desk beside my mother's last note, the one that simply read, "Thank you for the coffee." They sat there together, two very different kinds of endings, side by side. Some evenings, I'd drive out to the lake where everything seemed to begin and end. The water there was always calm, holding the reflection of the sky like memory itself. I'd sit for a while watching the ripples fade into stillness and think about the family I had lost and the one I had found. There was no bitterness left in those thoughts, only distance shaped gently by time. One spring morning, Allison called. Her voice was careful, almost hesitant. She said she'd been volunteering with a community outreach group helping young women with career placements. "You'd be proud," she told me. And I was. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't have to. The silence between us had changed shape. It wasn't absence anymore, just quiet understanding. Mark and I built a slower life near the lake, far from headlines and boardrooms. We still worked, still cared deeply about the science, but our days no longer revolved around proving anything. We planted a small garden behind the house. He took to cooking, and I learned the pleasure of unhurried mornings, the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight across the table, the sound of a life I'd built on my own terms. Sometimes people asked if I ever forgave my mother. I never knew quite how to answer. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a single act. It was the quiet decision to stop carrying someone else's story on your back. My mother's choices had shaped me, but they no longer defined me. Her final gesture, a small note, a few words of peace, was enough. Not for reconciliation, but for release. The last time I visited the lake, I brought a bouquet of white lilies, the same kind I'd left at the care home years ago. I walked to the edge of the water and watched them drift away, their reflection fading into the surface as the wind picked up. "Goodbye," I whispered, not to her exactly, but to the part of me that had waited so long for something that was never coming. The stillness that followed felt whole. On the drive home, the sky stretched wide and pale above the highway. I thought about everything that had led me here, the nights spent chasing approval, the years of silence, the small moments of kindness that had guided me forward. Justice, I realized, hadn't arrived through punishment or power. It had come quietly through self-respect, through learning when to stay and when to walk away. Peace is not the loud triumph of being right. It's the gentle knowing that you've built a life where no one can take your worth again. That's what I found in the end, not victory, but calm. The kind of calm that doesn't fade when the world gets loud again. If you've ever had to build yourself from silence, if you've had to step away to find your peace, I hope this story reminds you that strength isn't about how loudly you fight, it's about how softly you heal. Take a moment before you go. Breathe. Think about your own story, and if it touched something in you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear that peace can come quietly too.